1879, a boy walked away from his father's farm with nothing but a stubborn dream. 16 years old, no money, no future, no permission, just a hunger that refused to die. The world he left behind was slow, bound by horse carriages and trains, a world where automobiles were toys for the wealthy, fragile racing machines meant to amuse the rich. But this boy, Henry Ford, saw something else. He saw a world where ordinary men and women, the worker in the field, the clerk in the store, the teacher in the schoolhouse, could own the freedom of motion. They told him it was impossible. They told him he was foolish. Twice he failed. Twice he was humiliated. Twice he was cast aside. Yet failure did not break him. It became his fuel. 35 years after stepping off that farm, half of all the cars on Earth bore his name. The boy who hated the plow had built an empire of wheels, steel, and fire, and in the process, he rewrote not just the history of industry, but the destiny of America itself. But behind the legend lies a hidden truth of obsession and sacrifice, of bitter rivalries and secret wars, of a man whose greatest victories carried shadows that haunted him until his final days. This is not the simple story of a car company. It is the hypnotic journey of a poor farmer's son who defied the world, lost almost everything, and still managed to create a revolution that drives us to this very moment. This is the hidden truth of Henry Ford. Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, in the quiet countryside of Michigan when America was still reeling from the Civil War. His father, William Ford, was a farmer, proud, hard-working, bound to the earth. His mother, Mary, gentle but resilient, held the family together with warmth. The Ford household worked as one, plowing, milking, harvesting, repeating the endless cycle of rural life. But even as a child, Henry felt an ache inside. The soil was heavy in his hands, the plow too slow, the horses too stubborn. Farming, to him, was bondage. He once confessed, "I never had any particular love for the farm. It was the mother on the farm I loved." Mary Ford was his anchor, his compass, his sanctuary. She nurtured his restless curiosity. When other boys found joy in hunting or games, Henry found himself drawn to the strange rhythm of machines. At 12, his father gave him a pocket watch. Within hours, Henry had disassembled it, studied its heart, and reassembled it perfectly. Neighbors brought him their broken watches, and soon the boy was known as the local repairman, a farm child with the hands of an engineer. Then came the day that split his world in two. At 13, Henry lost his mother to illness. Her death carved a wound that never healed. Farming, already unbearable, became suffocating. The land that once smelled of her touch became a prison of memory. At 16, Henry stood on the edge of his father's fields, staring at the horizon. The farm expected him. The family depended on him. But destiny whispered louder. Against William's wishes, Henry packed a small bag, kissed the farm goodbye, and boarded a train bound for Detroit. He was just a boy with no money, no diploma, no safety net, but a hunger to escape the plow and master the machine. He would never look back.
Detroit in the late 1870s was not yet the motor city, but it pulsed with the restless energy of industry. Steam engines hissed, steel clanged, factories belched smoke into the air. For a boy raised on farmland silence, the city was intoxicating. Henry's first job was at the Michigan Car Company Works, helping build streetcars. 6 days later, he was fired. He was clumsy, too eager, too inexperienced, but failure only sharpened his obsession. Soon after, he found work as an apprentice at James Flower & Brothers Machine Shop. The pay was meager, $2.60 a week, not enough even for rent. To survive, Henry returned to his boyhood trade, watch repair. At night, by flickering lamplight, he cleaned and mended watches for $3 a week. His days stretched from dawn until midnight, machines filling every moment. Exhaustion never dulled his passion. He haunted the city's machine shops, studying gears, pistons, and engines. He learned not by books, but by touch, by listening to the heartbeat of steel. Detroit was his university, and its machines were his professors. In 1882, at 19, Henry returned briefly to his father's farm. He still hated farming, but something had changed. A portable steam engine arrived in the community. Farmers needed someone to operate it, and Henry stepped forward. For $3 a day, he mastered the beast, controlling its pistons with a calm that belied his age. Word spread across Michigan. Soon Henry's reputation reached Westinghouse, a giant in steam power. They hired him to service steam engines across the state. This was his first taste of respect. A poor farmer's son, now trusted with machines worth more than his father's entire farm. Yet steam engines, for all their power, were not enough. Henry's eyes had already turned to something new, something whispered about in European magazines, a strange invention powered not by steam, but by explosions within. The gas engine. The future had arrived, and Henry Ford was determined to catch it. In 1885, during a New Year's Eve dance, Henry Ford met Clara Bryant. She was the daughter of a farmer, spirited and kind, with a strength that matched Henry's restless ambition. Within a year they were married, and William Ford, perhaps still hoping to tether his son to the land, gave the couple 40 acres as a wedding gift. But Henry did not see a farm. He saw a workshop. Instead of plows, he filled his barn with tools and engines. Instead of crops, he sowed machines. Clara, far from resenting his obsession, stood by him, nursing their modest life while Henry burned midnight oil with gears and grease. In 1891, Henry's path crossed with the great force of his era, electricity. He joined the Edison Illuminating Company as a night engineer, tasked with keeping the city's steam-powered generators alive. The pay was $40 a month, then later $100 when he was promoted to chief engineer. But the real wealth lay in opportunity. At Edison, Henry could experiment freely, and in those long night shifts when the engines purred steadily, he devoured every scrap of knowledge about electricity and combustion. That same year, he built his first small gasoline engine on his kitchen table. Clara cooked while Henry's contraption sputtered and popped nearby. By 1896, he unveiled his first vehicle, the quadricycle, a crude machine of 4 bicycle wheels powered by a gasoline engine. It had no reverse gear, overheated quickly, and shook like a tin can. But it moved. And in that moment, Henry Ford became something the world had never seen before, an automotive dreamer. When Thomas Edison heard of Henry's experiments, he met the young engineer and told him, "Young man, keep at it. You are on the right track." That blessing was gasoline on Henry's fire. If Edison, the wizard of light, believed in him, then failure was not an option. The boy who once repaired watches in the dark had found his destiny. But destiny is never free, and soon Henry Ford would learn how brutally the world tests dreamers. Success did not arrive on wheels. It stumbled on wreckage. In 1899, Henry Ford secured investors and launched the Detroit Automobile Company. His dream had turned into a business. His machines, once personal experiments, were now products under pressure. But the company failed. His cars were too heavy, too slow, too expensive. The investors demanded passenger vehicles, while Henry obsessed over refining engines. After less than 2 years, the factory went silent. Henry was humiliated, branded a failure, and dismissed. But failure is a strange teacher. Henry would later say, "Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again, this time more intelligently." And so, freed from corporate chains, he turned to racing. Racing cars were the spectacles of their age, thrilling the public and showcasing innovation. In 1901, Henry Ford built a race car named Sweepstakes, and against all odds, defeated the nation's top driver, Alexander Winton. The victory was electric. Newspapers hailed the unknown mechanic from Detroit as a genius. Investors returned, drawn by the spectacle. The failure of Detroit Automobile was forgotten. Yet once more, conflict arose. Investors wanted passenger cars, and Henry still leaned towards racing and experimentation. They brought in another Henry, Henry Leland, to replace him. Furious, Ford walked away again. The company he left behind became Cadillac. Most men would have stopped, twice humiliated, twice abandoned. But Henry was not most men. He was stubborn, relentless, obsessed. In 1903, with a handful of investors and his friend Alexander Malcolmson, he tried one more time. This time, the name on the door was his alone, Ford Motor Company. He had failed twice. The third attempt would not just succeed, it would ignite a revolution.
Ford Motor Company opened in 1903 with modest ambition. Henry's first success was the Model A, a simple, sturdy car. Then came the Model N, affordable and reliable. By 1906, the Model N was the best-selling car in America. Yet Henry wasn't satisfied. He had a vision, radical and almost laughable, a car for everyone. Automobiles, at the time, were luxuries for the wealthy, handcrafted, slow to build, expensive to buy. Henry Ford wanted the opposite. A car strong enough for farmers, cheap enough for workers, reliable enough for families. He once declared, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude, so low in price that no man making a good salary will be unable to own one." In 1908, that promise took form, the Model T. Built with vanadium steel, light yet durable, simple in design, it was a marvel. It sold for $850, still high for the average worker, but cheaper than anything else of its quality. Orders flooded in, 15,000 in the first year alone. But Henry's genius wasn't just the car, it was how he built it. At a Chicago slaughterhouse, he had observed meat moving down a conveyor, each worker performing one task. Why not apply the same principle to cars? By 1913, Ford perfected the moving assembly line. Production time dropped from 12 hours to 90 minutes. Costs fell, prices fell, and with each drop, more people who had once only dreamed of owning a car now found themselves behind the wheel. The boy who once fled his father's farm had given wings to the world. By 1910, Ford had outgrown his Highland Park factory, but his ambitions were only beginning. He didn't want just to build cars. He wanted to build a system that could bend time itself. The assembly line was his answer. Imagine it. A car once required skilled craftsmen, hours of patience, and thousands of dollars. But Ford's vision stripped the process down to its bones. Each man, instead of crafting an entire machine, performed one simple task again and again. The car, not the worker, moved. From station to station, piece by piece, a skeleton of steel became flesh. When Ford introduced the moving assembly line in 1913, production times collapsed. What once took 12 hours now took 90 minutes. Costs fell, prices fell, and with each drop, more people who had once only dreamed of owning a car now found themselves behind the wheel. The Model T was no longer a machine. It was a revolution on wheels. Farmers who'd never traveled more than 10 miles from their land could now cross entire counties. Families who had never seen the city lights could drive into Detroit on Sunday. The automobile was no longer for the rich. It was for the worker, the teacher, the farmer's son. But innovation has two faces. For all its efficiency, the assembly line was soul-crushing. Men stood in place, repeating one motion thousands of times day after day. They called it a treadmill of hell. Turnover rates soared. Ford could build cars faster than ever before, but he couldn't keep workers in the factory. By the end of 1913, he faced a crisis, an assembly line without men to run it. Henry Ford had changed machines. Now he would have to change men. January 5, 1914. The world woke to a headline that seemed madness. Ford to pay $5 a day. At a time when the average worker barely earned $2.50 a day, Ford announced he would double wages, slash hours, and create a 5-day work week. Industrialists scoffed. Economists predicted ruin. The Wall Street Journal sneered, calling it an economic crime. How could a company survive by giving workers more and demanding less? But Henry Ford was not playing the game others played. He was rewriting it. His reasoning was disarmingly simple.
If you want workers to build cars, you must pay them enough to buy them. The result was electric. Within days, 10,000 men stormed Ford's factory gates, desperate for a job. Turnover vanished, productivity soared, and for the first time in industrial history, the worker was also the customer. Ford's employees drove the very machines they built. The $5 day was more than generosity. It was strategy wrapped in humanity. It made Ford Motor Company a magnet for talent, a fortress against competitors, and a symbol of possibility. Workers across America demanded similar pay, and slowly, grudgingly, other companies followed. Ford had lit a fire under labor itself. But this revolution was not without shadows. Ford's generosity came with strings. He created a sociological department that monitored workers' homes, marriages, and drinking habits. To earn the full $5, a man had to prove he lived morally by Ford's standards. To some, it felt less like freedom, more like surveillance. Still, the legacy endured. For the first time, laborers could dream not only of survival, but of dignity. The poor farmer's son had given the working man more than wages. He had given him hope.
As Europe erupted into World War I in 1914, Henry Ford found himself in a strange position. He loathed war, famously declaring, "A business devoted to service will have only one worry about profits. They will be embarrassingly large." He believed machines should liberate men, not kill them. In 1915, he even financed a peace ship, chartering an ocean liner filled with activists and pacifists to Europe, hoping to negotiate an end to the war. The press ridiculed him. Newspapers called it naive, even foolish. The peace mission collapsed. Ford returned home humiliated. Yet, as America entered the war in 1917, the government turned to him. Ford's factories, designed to churn out cars at unprecedented speed, could be repurposed to build trucks, ambulances, and engines for the military. Reluctantly, Ford complied. His Model T, nicknamed the Tin Lizzie, was transformed into a vehicle of war, carrying soldiers, supplies, and even stretchers across the battlefields of France. The contradiction was stark. The man who despised war had built the machines that helped win it. Ford himself wrestled with the irony. But history is not clean. It is filled with compromises, and Ford's factories had become the beating heart of industrial America. By the time the war ended, Ford Motor Company had grown not weaker, but stronger. The world had seen what mass production could do, and Ford, the pacifist-turned-reluctant arms supplier, emerged not as a failed dreamer, but as an indispensable industrialist. The farmer's son had now become something larger, a man whose decisions could tilt the balance of nations. By the 1920s, Henry Ford was no longer simply a businessman. He was a symbol. The Model T dominated the roads, the assembly line dominated industry, and Ford himself, once a boy repairing watches in the dark, was now one of the richest men in the world. At his peak, Henry Ford's personal fortune was estimated at over $1 billion in today's terms. His company's revenues exceeded entire nations. When asked about wealth, he shrugged. A business that makes nothing but money is a poor kind of business. Yet money was not his goal. Control was. In 1919, frustrated by investors meddling in his company, Ford orchestrated a daring move. He secretly had his son, Edsel, announce plans to start a competing company. Investors, fearing their stock would collapse, panicked and sold. Ford then bought them out, every last one. The gambit cost him millions, but left him with absolute power. Ford Motor Company became his empire, and he its sole ruler. This power brought both brilliance and blindness. He continued slashing Model T prices, bringing cars to millions more. By 1924, the price had dropped to under $300, less than a working man's 3 months' wages. Farmers drove them, teachers drove them, ministers drove them. The Model T was no longer a luxury, it was a way of life. But critics whispered, Ford was stubborn, dictatorial, unwilling to adapt. While rivals like General Motors introduced stylish models in colors other than black, Ford clung to the Model T, insisting it was all the world needed. For years, sales soared anyway, but beneath the surface, the seeds of decline were already sown. For now, though, Henry Ford stood at the height of his power, richer than kings, adored by millions, feared by rivals. The farm boy had conquered the machine, the market, and the myth of the American dream. Every empire casts shadows, and Henry Ford's was no exception. At Highland Park, Ford's sociological department still pried into workers' lives, dictating how they should live, drink, and even raise their children. Many resented it. "He pays us well," one worker said, "but he wants to own our souls." Ford himself grew restless. Wealth had not softened him, it had hardened him. He distrusted bankers, despised unions, and believed his vision was beyond question. He poured money into newspapers to spread his views, some of which veered into darker territory, anti-Semitic writings that would stain his reputation forever. Yet, alongside these shadows, his genius continued to shine. He experimented with farming rubber and Brazil, with soybeans as a base for plastics, with airplanes and tractors. He dreamed not just of cars, but of reshaping life itself. His River Rouge plant in Michigan became the largest industrial complex in the world, a city within a city, turning raw ore into finished cars in a single flow. But inside his own company, cracks widened. His son, Edsel, gentle and creative, struggled under the weight of his father's dominance. Ford dismissed Edsel's pleas for modernization, insisting the Model T was eternal. Sales faltered, rivals surged. By 1927, Ford had no choice. The Model T, after producing over 15 million units, was retired. The end of an era. The car that had carried America into the modern world was gone. And for Henry Ford, it was the first real acknowledgement that he was not invincible. The farmer's son had built a revolution, but revolutions, like machines, must evolve or rust.
In 1927, a silence fell over Ford's factories. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the lines were still. The Model T, the car that had carried farmers, teachers, soldiers, and dreamers into modern life, was no more. For years, Henry Ford had insisted that the people can have any color car they want so long as it's black. He believed the Model T was perfect, but perfection has an expiration date. General Motors had begun offering cars in bright colors, with chrome trim, with styles that whispered aspiration. Consumers, especially the younger generation, wanted more than utility. They wanted beauty. Ford, after years of denial, finally conceded. He shut down production and ordered his team to build something new. It was his son, Edsel, who carried the burden of design. Sensitive, artistic, and visionary in ways his father was not, Edsel poured himself into the creation of the new car, the Model A. When the Model A debuted in December 1927, it stunned the nation. It was elegant yet affordable, stylish yet simple. Crowds swarmed dealerships. Orders poured in. For a brief moment, the Ford Motor Company felt alive again. But beneath the celebration, a strain lingered. The Model A was not Henry's vision. It was Edsel's. And Henry, though he smiled for the cameras, felt the loss of control like a wound. For the first time, the empire was not purely his creation. The Model A sold them in millions. It saved the company from collapse. But for Henry Ford, it was also a reminder the world was changing, and he could not stop it. The roaring 20s gave way to the shattering 30s. Wall Street crashed in October 1929, and the Great Depression swept across America like a winter that would never end. Banks collapsed, farms failed, bread lines stretched for blocks. For Henry Ford, the Depression was a test unlike any other. His River Rouge complex, the largest industrial site on Earth, suddenly echoed with silence.
Demand for cars plummeted, production slowed, and thousands of men who had once found dignity on Ford's lines now found themselves locked out, jobless, desperate. At first, Ford clung to his belief that prosperity was just around the corner. He declared that the country needed more production, not less. He ordered his plants to keep running, even at a loss, believing that cars could pull the nation back to health. But economics bowed to no man, not even Henry Ford. Sales collapsed. Ford Motor Company laid off tens of thousands. Men marched to River Rouge demanding work. Police and guards met them with clubs and bullets. In March 1932, during what became known as the Ford Hunger March, 4 workers were killed and dozens injured. The images seared into America's conscience. Starving men lying in the snow, their blood staining the ground outside the gates of Ford's empire. The farmer's son who had once championed the working man now seemed like his enemy. The newspapers that had once praised his $5 wage now condemned him as a tyrant. Ford did not waver. He blamed agitators, communists, anyone but himself. But in his heart, perhaps he knew the truth. His dream of harmony between worker and machine was fracturing. The Depression stripped away illusions, and Henry Ford, once seen as the patron saint of labor, found himself recast as its oppressor. If the Depression revealed cracks in Ford's empire, the rise of organized labor turned those cracks into fractures. Across the nation, workers demanded unions, collective bargaining, and fair treatment. At Ford Motor Company, they demanded something even simpler: dignity. But Henry Ford hated unions. To him, they were parasites. He believed he knew what was best for his men, and he would not share power. To enforce his will, Ford relied on Harry Bennett, a former Navy boxer who became the head of Ford's infamous service department. Officially, Bennett's men handled security. In truth, they acted as Ford's private army. Thousands of toughs who patrolled factories, spied on workers, and beat organizers. The most infamous clash came in 1937 on an overpass outside the River Rouge plant. Union leaders from the United Auto Workers arrived to hand out pamphlets. Bennett's men attacked. Photographers captured the scene. Union men beaten to the ground, blood on their faces, bodies sprawled against the concrete. The pictures made headlines around the world. It became known as the Battle of the Overpass. Ford denied responsibility, but the images told a story words could not. The man who had once revolutionized labor was now its fiercest enemy. Public opinion turned. The government pressed Ford to recognize unions. For years he resisted, but by 1941, even Henry Ford could no longer fight the tide. Strikes shut down his plants. President Roosevelt's administration leaned hard. Finally, Ford Motor Company signed its first contract with the United Auto Workers. The irony was bitter. Henry Ford, who had once doubled wages and given the working man his first car, had ended his career fighting the very people he claimed to serve.
As the 1930s wore on, Henry Ford was no longer the vibrant tinkerer of his youth. He was an old man, increasingly isolated, increasingly feared. His empire remained vast, but his personal world shrank. The greatest tragedy came in 1943. Edsel Ford, his only son, the gentle heir who had carried the company through innovation and grace, died of stomach cancer at just 49. For Henry, it was an unspeakable loss. He had spent years belittling Edsel, ignoring his counsel, undermining his authority. Now, with Edsel gone, the regret was immense. Ford wept openly, a rare crack in the armor of control. With Edsel's death, Henry reassumed direct control of the company. But he was nearly 80, his health failing, his mind slipping. Executives whispered of confusion, paranoia, indecision. The company faltered. Rivals surged ahead. At one point, government officials considered seizing control of Ford Motor Company, fearing the old man was no longer capable of managing the vast enterprise essential to wartime production.
Eventually, Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, was brought in to lead. The torch had passed, though Henry himself resisted until the end. The empire was no longer his alone. Loss does strange things to a man. For Henry Ford, it brought a kind of reckoning. In the quiet of his estate, Fairlane, he would wander the grounds, remembering the farm he had once fled, the mother he had lost, the watch he had taken apart as a boy. He had conquered the world, but not himself. The richest industrialist of his age now seemed like a man weighed down not by machines or markets, but by memory. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford died of a cerebral hemorrhage in his Dearborn estate. He was 83 years old. Outside, the Rouge River had flooded, cutting power across the city. For a brief moment, Dearborn returned to darkness. A fitting farewell to the man who had once lit the world with machines. His funeral drew thousands. Workers, farmers, dignitaries, presidents. They came to honor, to mourn, and perhaps to reckon. For Henry Ford was no simple hero. He was a paradox. He gave the working man a car and a wage, but he also spied on him, beat him, resisted his right to unionize. He preached peace, then built engines for war. He despised bankers, but became wealthier than most of them combined. He loved the idea of progress, yet clung stubbornly to the past. What remains undeniable is this: Henry Ford changed the world. He did not invent the automobile, but he democratized it. He did not invent the assembly line, but he transformed it into a force that would reshape every industry. He did not set out to build an empire, but in chasing his dream, he gave birth to one. Today, Ford Motor Company remains a titan. Highways, suburbs, even the shape of our cities bear the imprint of his vision. But beyond the machines, beyond the billions, lies something more fragile. The memory of a farmer's son who dared to believe that every man, no matter how poor, deserved a chance to move. Henry Ford was not a saint. He was not a devil. He was human. And it is in that humanity, flawed, brilliant, stubborn, tender, that his story still speaks to us. When war clouds darkened the skies of Europe in the late 1930s, the world again turned to its factories. And in Detroit, no factory was larger, louder, and more vital than Henry Ford's River Rouge. At first, Henry resisted. He had always been skeptical of war, suspicious of bankers and politicians who profited from it. In the First World War, he had once chartered a peace ship, naively sailing across the Atlantic to negotiate peace himself. But the Second World War was different. The stakes were global. The government came knocking, demanding planes, engines, tanks. And Ford, the man who had once built cars for farmers, now found his factories building machines for soldiers. At Willow Run, a massive plant outside Detroit, Ford set out to prove that the assembly line could win wars. He promised to build a bomber every hour. Critics laughed, but soon B-24 Liberators rolled off the lines like Model Ts once had. By the end of the war, Ford's plant was producing nearly one plane every 63 minutes. It was industry as weapon, efficiency as arsenal. For millions of Americans, the Ford name became synonymous not just with cars, but with victory. Workers spoke with pride of building the planes that their brothers and sons would fly across the oceans. The arsenal of democracy, President Roosevelt called it, and Ford's factories were its beating heart. But even in triumph, shadows lingered. Henry's earlier flirtations with isolationism, his open skepticism of America's entry into the war, and his publication of anti-Semitic writings in the 1920s returned to haunt his reputation. The contradictions sharpened. He was both patriot and pariah, savior and suspect. History rarely gives us clean lines. In Henry Ford's story, the edges were always blurred.
By the 1940s, Henry Ford was no longer just an industrialist. He was a political symbol.
To some, he embodied the self-made farmer who conquered the modern age. To others, he was a dangerous demagogue, a man whose wealth gave him too much sway over the public mind. His forays into politics had been clumsy. In the 1920s, he ran for the U.S. Senate at President Wilson's urging, only to lose narrowly, undone by his blunt refusal to play party games. Newspapers once speculated he could be president if he wanted, but Henry Ford wanted no part of Washington's compromises. Still, his words carried weight. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, had once spread anti-Semitic conspiracies that tarnished his legacy forever. Though he later issued a public apology, many never forgave, and his suspicion of financiers, whom he saw as parasitic middlemen, hardened into prejudice that history could not excuse. During the Depression, populists and radicals had quoted Ford as a kind of prophet. During the war, isolationists had looked to him as proof that America should avoid foreign entanglements. Henry, uncomfortable with the labels, nonetheless reveled in his power to shape opinion. But politics has a way of outlasting men. By the 1940s, his voice had faded. Roosevelt ignored him. Congress distrusted him, and younger Americans, especially returning soldiers, looked less to Ford for guidance and more to new leaders, new ideas. The farmer's son who once dreamed of building a car for the common man had become an old man, watching the nation he helped build pass him by. By the mid-1940s, Henry Ford was in his 80s. His mind, once quick as an engine's spark, slowed. He forgot things, repeated himself, made erratic decisions. Executives whispered of confusion, of meetings that went in circles, of an empire drifting without a captain. The death of Edsel in 1943 had left a wound that never healed. Henry had mocked his son's gentleness, dismissed his vision. Now, with Edsel gone, he seemed hollow, filled with regret. In private, he spoke of seeing his son's face in dreams, of conversations unfinished. In public, he tried to act as if nothing had changed, but those close to him knew it had. The company stumbled. Rivals surged ahead. Chrysler, General Motors, they innovated while Ford hesitated. Executives begged him to step aside. Government officials worried aloud about the collapse of one of America's most important war suppliers. In 1945, the solution arrived, in the form of Henry Ford II, Edsel's son, just 28 years old, hardened by war, educated in modern management. The Deuce, as workers nicknamed him, began to take control. Slowly, reluctantly, Henry let go. He retreated to Fairlane, his Dearborn estate. He walked the gardens, tinkered in his workshop, and stared for long hours at the Rouge River flowing past. To visitors, he seemed both proud and lonely, a man who had built an empire, yet was powerless to hold on to it. The machines still bore his name, but the future no longer belonged to him. Death has a way of simplifying a man, and when Henry Ford died on April 7, 1947, America began the long process of turning the man into a myth. Newspapers hailed him as the man who put the world on wheels. They praised his genius, his stubbornness, his vision. Schoolbooks would remember the 5-day day, the assembly line, the Model T. They would not dwell long on the blood spilled at River Rouge or the hateful words once printed in his newspaper. In Dearborn, thousands lined the streets for his funeral. Farmers who had once driven their first Fords hitched up their wagons to pay respects. Workers who had once cursed his service department now wept as his coffin passed. Presidents sent condolences. The world paused to remember. Over time, Ford became less a man than a symbol of American ingenuity, of progress, of the promise and peril of industry. His faults blurred in the haze of nostalgia. His triumphs grew brighter. But myths, like machines, are built, and behind every myth is a truth more complicated. Henry Ford was not simply the saint of industry, nor its villain. He was both, and something in between.
Perhaps that is why his story still matters. It reminds us that progress is never pure, that even the greatest dreams leave shadows, that the men who change the world are also changed by it.
At the end, when the noise of the factories had faded, when the battles of labor and politics were behind him, Henry Ford was still, in some deep way, the boy from the farm. He never loved farming, but he loved the land. He loved the smell of soil after rain, the hum of machines in the barn, the quiet of Michigan fields at dusk. For all his billions, he preferred plain clothes, simple food, long walks. He had no taste for aristocracy. He mistrusted elites. He believed, stubbornly, in the dignity of the common man. And perhaps that was his truest legacy. Not the cars, not the factories, not even the wealth, but the idea that ordinary people deserved access to the extraordinary, that a farm boy could shape the world, that a machine could shrink distances, expand dreams, and give a family a chance to move not just down the road, but upward in life. Ford's story is not one of perfection, it is one of persistence, of a man who failed twice before he succeeded, of a tinkerer who turned an obsession into an empire, of a human being, flawed and brilliant, who believed that life could be made better if machines were made simpler. Today, when we drive highways that lace across the nation, when we pass suburban houses built for commuters, when we sit behind the wheel of a car we barely think twice about, we are living inside his dream. Henry Ford's revolution was not just mechanical, it was human, and that is why it endures. In the twilight of his life, Henry Ford was a man surrounded not by machines, but by ghosts. At Fairlane, his sprawling estate, the great industrialist often sat alone, gazing across the Rouge River, where the factories belched smoke into the sky. The empire still bore his name, but the power had slipped from his hands. Age had slowed him, memory betrayed him, and the boy who once tinkered with a pocket watch was now an old man wrestling with time itself. It was not the cars that haunted him, nor the assembly line. It was people. The son he had lost, the workers he had fought, the words he had once printed that spread hate across the country. Henry had built a machine that lifted millions, yet along the way he had hurt many too. Friends said he grew softer in those years, even tender. He spoke less of profits, more of family. He kept Edsel's room untouched as if waiting for him to return. He visited Clara, his wife, more often, leaning on her presence after decades of neglecting her in favor of his work. Sometimes he would sit with her in the parlor and simply listen to the clock ticking on the mantel, as if the rhythm of time itself could soothe the fractures of the past. History is harsh with its titans. It remembers their victories and their sins, but rarely the quiet ache of their regrets. For Henry Ford, the man who put the world on wheels, regret was the machine he could not disassemble, the engine he could not repair. Clara Jane Bryant Ford had walked beside Henry since the early days, long before fame and fortune. She had endured his long absences, his obsession with the factory, his stubborn quarrels with their son. And yet, in those later years, it was Clara who offered him something that no fortune could buy: forgiveness. Neighbors remembered seeing them strolling together in the gardens of Fairlane, Henry's arm hooked gently through hers. Once Clara was overheard telling a friend, "He gave his life to the world. I only wish he had saved more of it for us." It was not bitterness, but a soft truth spoken by a woman who had carried the weight of a marriage tethered to an empire. Henry had once thought love was something separate from work, something fragile that slowed a man's progress. But as his empire grew beyond his control, he began to see that love, Clara's steady love, was the only constant. When the engines roared too loudly, when rivals eclipsed him, when even his own mind faltered, Clara remained. Her forgiveness was not loud. It was quiet, steady, lived out in gestures, pouring his tea, smoothing his coat, sitting with him by the fire in silence.
She had every reason to resent him, yet she chose to stay, to see him not as a giant of industry, but as the boy she married in 1888, the man who once brought her wildflowers and spoke shyly of dreams. Forgiveness, in the end, was Clara's revolution, and it gave Henry something more enduring than wealth: peace in the arms of the woman who had walked through every storm with him. For decades, Henry Ford had battled unions, resisted strikes, and demanded loyalty from the men on his lines. Yet, in the final chapter of his life, a strange reconciliation unfolded. The very workers who once cursed his name began to speak of him with reverence. They remembered the $5 day, the higher wages that changed their family's fortunes. They remembered the cars that gave them freedom, the jobs that pulled them from poverty during the Depression. For every story of pain, there was another of gratitude. At Ford's funeral, workers stood shoulder to shoulder with presidents and businessmen. A factory worker named Miguel Lopez, who had immigrated from Mexico, told a reporter, "I came here with nothing. Ford gave me a job, and now my son is going to college. I'll never forget that." This was the paradox of Henry Ford. He was both the tyrant and the benefactor, the oppressor and the liberator. His factories had ground men down, yet they had also lifted them up. And in the balance of history, many chose to forgive, to remember the man not for his battles, but for the opportunities he created. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is remembering differently. For Ford's workers, it was choosing to see their lives not only through the lens of hardship, but through the windows of the cars he made possible.
When the nation looked back on Henry Ford after his death, it faced a choice. Would it remember the man who spread hate, or the man who spread mobility? The one who fought unions, or the one who lifted wages? The dictator of his empire, or the dreamer who gave the world the Model T? History, as it often does, chose the myth. Textbooks painted him as the genius who put America on wheels. Hollywood turned his story into a symbol of progress. The contradictions blurred and the rough edges softened. And maybe that is as it should be. For myths are not lies, they are choices. Choices about what a people wish to carry forward. The America of the mid-20th century chose to remember Ford's vision, not his failings. They chose to forgive, not erase, but forgive, because his dream was bigger than his flaws. And perhaps because, in forgiving him, they were forgiving something in themselves, the ambition that cuts too sharply, the pride that blinds, the mistakes we all make in pursuit of something larger. The myth of Henry Ford endures because it is not just about Henry Ford, it is about us. In the end, Henry Ford's life was not a straight road, but a circle, a wheel. He began as a farmer's son, discontent with the soil, dreaming of machines. He ended as an old man, weary of machines, seeking again the peace of the soil. Forgiveness was the final turning of that wheel. Forgiveness from Clara, from his workers, from a nation that chose to see his humanity more than his hate. Forgiveness that allowed the story of a flawed man to become the story of a revolution. Today, when we drive a car down a quiet highway at dusk, we are living inside Henry Ford's dream. And if we listen closely, we can hear something in the hum of the engine. Not just mechanics, but memory. The memory of a boy who refused to accept the farm as his destiny, who imagined something greater, and who, in his triumphs and failures alike, changed the way the world moves. Love, forgiveness, reflection. These are the engines that endure when steel rusts and fortunes fade. And they remind us that behind every machine is a human heart, fragile and complicated, striving to leave a mark. Henry Ford's story is not just the story of cars. It is the story of humanity's restless hope. And that, more than any invention, is what makes his revolution eternal.